and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we've got the rest of Dragons of Winter Night to go over. So without further ado, let's march on. Last time we found out how Solamnia are organized and that Sturm was brokenhearted about what the Knights have become. This time we've got Raistlin, who in one chapter experiments with the Dragon Orb, which nearly overwhelms him. The writing is a little weird in this last part of Winter Night. Fizban and Lord Gunther end up meeting at long last, where it is revealed that the gnomes were given the Dragon Orb so that they could try to crack the code to it, so to speak, which is a pretty dangerous thing to do considering how dangerous the Dragon Orb is, just how uncareful and honestly dumb gnomes are in this universe. This is not a good idea. Lord Gunther having made the decision rather foolishly. This is one foolish moment in the entirety of the franchise.
You might as well hand over the Dragon Orb to a bunch of Kender.
In Tolkien's Legendarium, gnomes is another word for the Noldor, elves. But somehow in D&D they got butchered into being short, stupid people, or are autistically obsessed with invention, but are incompetent at everything else. They're basically less good halflings than the Kender, which I'm gonna be honest, I don't like D&D or Dragonlance gnomes, and I prefer to pretend they generally don't exist. Or I'm of the mindset that maybe they should have been genocided in universe in order to raise the stakes on one of the wars, whether the War of Souls or the War of the Lance, because they don't contribute anything to the universe and they're never really used beyond this trilogy and Legends. Both Legends, it's further back in the timeline. So after this, they're not used. Why would you use them? They're a throwaway race that contributes nothing to the lore or the Legendarium. They should never have been brought in. They're just another butt monkey. And honestly, you already have the Kender, you have Flint. We're getting to have too many butt monkeys. Even Warcraft used them as butt monkeys. How did we go from the Noldor elves, the most interesting part of Tolkien's Legendarium, to this? You know, I know this is going to be very controversial, but the whole idea of subversion is not a good idea, and deconstruction is not a good idea in a franchise. But maybe this was the first step towards doing that to fantasy. Maybe this is why fantasy fiction declined, because there was no respect shown for the gnomes of Middle-earth. And I'm not saying that Noldor are integral to everything in fantasy, just that this was the first incremental step towards deconstructing all of fantasy and tearing it apart. Why should we take Feanor Fingolfin seriously?
Part of me that didn't understand is like opening the D&G rulebook and looking at gnomes and halflings, and it's like, why are there two of them that have essentially the exact same description?
Well, it's a matter of, like I said, I almost think deconstruction here, and that's not a good thing, because gnomes are inventors. Get this! The Noldor are inventors, but they turn the inventiveness of the Noldor into a joke and a pantomime act. Yeah, I don't really care for them. Nosh contributes nothing to the literature or the lore, so he will not be mentioned further on in this video beyond just him collecting the various pieces and shards of the Dragon Orb and then doing nothing with his knowledge, when this could have been a plot point for another story, but it's a way of writing him out of the story. And the whole Mount Nevermind, where gnomes have such long names and put such emphasis on names and whatnot, this feels like it's mocking Tolkien, but it's a rather dumb joke. Tolkien had 50 different names for his characters, especially his Noldor, but it's actually a fascinating part of his literature. This just turns it into a really dumb joke. Yeah, this is not a part of Dragonlance I really like.
I'm very neutral towards this. Like, okay, so you have this culture. What are you going to do with it? Nothing. We're just going to use it as a great big joke.
Elves send out in chapter 6 Elistan to deliver an ultimatum to Lord Gunther, with Elistan himself very nervous and diplomatic. And Elistan, while we've had our criticism of him, from here on out is very, very reliable. Even in earlier chapters, he was, to a large extent. At least when I say earlier chapters, I mean this part of Winter Night. He's nervous because he's like, we're on the precipice of a war between elves and man, because the elves are dumb. Meanwhile, Palanthas rejected the Solamnic Knights' aid and refused to allow them to garrison the city because Lord Derek, Crown Guard, screwed up his diplomacy check and proceeded to insult Palanthas and almost threatened to burn it to the ground. And it was not till Sturm basically went on his bent knees and begged for forgiveness that Palanthas agreed to, when the snows melt, to send supplies. Derek is proving himself to be a monstrously stupid individual at this point, but he's so enraged with Sturm and feels so slighted that he's starting to mess up his military command, which historically this happened more times than can be mentioned. And oftentimes in war, it's not who's more brilliant, but rather who will make the stupider mistake. That said, Gunther comments on how the knights once preferred faith over magic, but now have chosen magic over faith, and is worried about this. This is a fascinating part of the story and shows that Lord Gunther's a philosophical individual. And I really like that the Solamnic Knights are rather more philosophically oriented than almost any other character, save Raceland. Depressing a thought to think that you've fallen so far from your traditions that you have to rely on everything that's antithetical to your traditions in this way. So which is better, to rely on their faith or inventions, that is to say magic? They need to survive, they need to protect the world from the evil of Naraka, but they're turning away from their faith, their core values. So is it really a victory, or are they succumbing to the lure that Naraka has offered? Are they sinking to the same level? It's a fascinating philosophical query there. So what's your opinion on that one?
Sinestro, and when the Green Lantern Corps started killing, Sinestro laughed because he found, yes, my forces were fought off, but I won. I got the Green Lantern Corps to compromise its one golden rule: not to kill. And this is a similar situation. Yeah, you need all this technology and magic to win the war, but what's the point of it if you lose what it means for your culture?
Now the difference, though, is that the Green Lantern Corps for a time came to favor Sodom Yat, the Derek Crown Guard of DC Comics, over Hal Jordan and Kyle Rayner, who are basically the Stern Brightblades of the Green Lantern Corps. And here, Derek and his psychology is firmly rejected by the Solamnics. The Council of the Whitestone meeting begins, and Solostrin demands the Dragon Orb, and basically say, we'll go to war if you don't give it to us. Lord Gunther's saying, knock it off, because you've enslaved the Kaganesti and are trying to genocide them. You're trying to start a war with me, and you're laying claim to an object you've not been able to control so far. At this point in their history, the elves have no chance of winning such a battle against the Solamnic Knights. They have no chance. Only a token force of the Qualinesti and Sylvanesti. This is just their nobility. The Solamnics, though, only have a small force nearby because they're having to deploy a great deal of their forces elsewhere. But even a token force by them could wipe out Solostrin, Porthios, and Alhana's 1X. I forget his name. He's not important. Solostrin then declares war against Solamnia, because of course he does. Gunther mentions Lorana gifted the Dragon Orb to the Solamnics, and you know what? Given that she's a true and tried warrior and she should be counted as an adult, it's hers. Is she here? Sure. How come she doesn't get a vote either? And this just enrages Solostrin into saying, I don't have a daughter, and disowning Lorana because Solostrin is evil. No, it's just that simple. Like, the guy wants to start a war over something he can't actually use. And his mentality is to abandon the rest of the world, and for the Qualinesti and Sylvanesti to create a new kingdom in exile, and that they will ally with Naraka in return for doing nothing to aid even their own peasants. This is the literal definition of madness. They are in complete denial about the threat that they're facing, and they still have not learned anything from their mistakes with the King Priest. That said, on page 308, we have proof of really bad writing in regards to Fizban, and I know how people will say, what do you mean bad writing? He describes Porthios as a good man. Of the dialogue makes no sense, as Porthios is the exact opposite of how I described good. He's genocidal, he's a slave master.
He's a narcissist.
Honestly, there's nothing likable. Fizban does, however, prevent disaster. Tass ends up destroying the Dragon Orb, and as mentioned, Fizban says, you're a good boy, Porthios. The thing is, Tass's destruction of the Dragon Orb even enraged Lord Gunther. I have the theory that it's more the Whitestone and the chaotic nature of Tass that destroyed the Dragon Orb, and that later when Tass complains, am I destined to smash these things, I don't know if he could do it on his own. And I'm of the opinion that even if Caramon and Lorana took their full force and chucked the orb from the top of the High Claris Tower at the ground, it just bounced along. It wouldn't put even a dent in the Dragon Orb. Theros, for his part, ends up revealing the Dragonlance and using it to smash open the White Stone. Chapter 7 of Book 3 sees Elistan trying to convince Lorana to not journey to Selvanost, as she is desperate to go see Tanis, and she's formally disinherited from her father and vows never to live amongst her people, which is sad, as the Qualinesti are good people. It's just their nobility that have become so rotten, having been corrupted by civilization, as they have, if one goes by Howardian logic, that they're in for a tough time, which will later breed tough individuals. And the thing about the barbarian archetype, as posited by Grimdark, is that the barbarian will come to restore the core values of the civilization. And maybe that's what Qualinesti needs. It's mentioned on page 315 that Sturm scores a major victory when he is allowed to wear his armor and carry himself as a knight of Solamnia, having finally been knighted, thanks to Lorana's defense of him. And Lorana shows the first cracks in her leadership. On page 316 to 317, she insists going after Tanis again, and Gunther tells her, I need a favor, and tells her, we know politics, you and I, lady, so I am going to arrange all my game pieces before you. Ostensibly, you will be traveling to Palanthos to teach the knights to use the Dragonlances. It is a legitimate reason. Without Theros, you and the dwarf are the only ones who understand their usage. And let's face it, the dwarf is too short to handle one. He's right. And Gunther goes on, you will take the lances to Palanthos, but more importantly, you will carry with you a writ of vindication from the council, fully restoring Sturm's honor. That will strike the death's blow to Derek's ambition. And Lorana whines and cries about this and goes, but why me? I can teach anyone, Lord Michael, for example, to use the Dragonlance. He can take them to Palanthos. He can carry the writ to Sturm. Lady, you still do not understand. I cannot trust Lord Michael. I cannot. I dare not trust any one of the knights with this. Derek has been knocked from his horse, so to speak, but he hasn't lost a tourney yet. I need someone I can trust implicitly. Someone who knows Derek for what he is, who has Sturm's best interests at heart. I do have Sturm's interests at heart. I put them above the interests of the knighthood. Now, she says this coldly, and I'm just left going, she does not want to go save Sturm's life, as Sturm is surrounded by enemies, and she's come to know that the knighthood means Sturm harm. But Sturm's only chance of survival is with part of the knighthood that wants him to survive. You have two factions. Sturm's only chance of survival lies with the Gunther faction, but she wants to turn her back on him and abandon him, which will leave him prey to the Crown Guard faction, which still has the upper hand. And Gunther ends up telling her, but remember, Lady Lorana, Sturm's only interest is the knighthood. What would happen to him, do you think, if the knighthood should fall? What will happen to him if Derek seizes control? Here, Lorana was being very irrational, which it runs in her family, which just makes me wonder how Gilthanas ended up so smart. He was the neglected one in the family. Him and Tanis are both smart, and they were neglected. And we also get the fascinating meeting of Elistan and Paladin, where Elistan ends up startled when he meets him. His face is white beneath its weathered tan. He's asked if he has ever met Paladin before, to which Elistan says, indeed we have, sir. I did not realize it before now, and though we were but lately introduced, I feel that I have known you a long, long time. Indeed? You're not making some sort of comment on my age, are you? At this point, Paladin is trolling him. No, certainly not. Elistan smiled. The old man's face cleared. Well, I'll have a pleasant journey and a safe one. Farewell. Oh, by the way, the name's Fizzban. I'll remember it. Given how the meeting could have gone, it should have been a lot more interesting, but it's not terribly interesting, but it's clear that on some level, Elistan did recognize Paladin. But Paladin refused to take him seriously and basically clowned on him. The next chapter sees the companions finally arrive in Flotsam, where two of them swap out their outfits for Team Rocket outfits. I'm joking, because they may as well be wearing that. And of course, it is suggested that it is possible that the Dragon High Lord is searching for them, with Caramon a little spooked. Tanis complains about them getting spooked, and Riverwind accuses Raceland of betraying them, which causes Raceland to return his glance coolly, so that he doesn't even deign to answer. At this point, this is the same thing that Derek was doing with Sturm. You're alienating your most loyal party member and your most competent party member. And we gotta bear in mind, Raceland is the most loyal to the cause of the heroes, because he understands what will happen if Takesis takes control of the world, that this will be the end of everything. Tanis and Caramon go to and meet the captain of Perichon. Her name is Maquesta Carthon, or Mac, and she's apparently of the dark-skinned race living in northern Urgoth. Yes, she's a black sheriff. I'm joking.
Worked in blazing saddles.
Yeah, true. She ends up negotiating with them where they're going, where she'll drop them off in Kalaman, and when she goes to Stretch, of course, Caramon checks her out. I thought he was supposed to be totally in love with Tika. Yeah, I know, a guy will still check out another chick. It happens, even when you're in love with someone. But Caramon's never one to deny himself temptation, which, I'm just saying. They see Barum, and Caramon and Tanis reveal themselves to be fairly slow, to say the least. Sometimes Tanis is really smart. I have said that before, but there are times when, because they don't, you have Tanis. No, when I first saw him, referring to Barum, I thought of Pax Tharkis and Sturm, and they're asked, hey, are you going to gawk at Barum? They go, oh, well, I guess I don't know him. Of course, Tanis goes off into the city to look around, ends up beset upon by an elf. The elf had lost his family and decides to take to the city and kill dragon army men. Tanis manages to halt him, and Kitiara stabs the man from behind. I wish that they had actually turned this guy into an actual character, because I'm curious as to his story and where it could have gone, given that he's going around becoming Solomon Kane, elf style.
That would have been cool.
But on the other hand, they did need to introduce Kitiara, and he spends the next few days in debauchery with her, getting information about how Takesis wants the green gemstone man. She's got pretty loose lips, especially to her lovers. I thought she was supposed to be leading a military command. Obviously, it's not a great priority for her. Sturm ends up, as said, negotiating with Palanthas after Derek screws up. Derek slanders Lorana on page 346 in such a way that even has me insulted when he say, "What did you promise the elf woman in return for her lies? Marriage? Make a respectable woman of her?" Basically, Derek has the same opinion of Lorana that Solastrin and Porthios have. You know, these guys are sleazeballs. And this insinuates more about them than it does Lorana. And that, I'm going to be honest, they're probably brothel visitors. I'm just saying, like, why is it that this is all they think that she could be motivated by? Lorana makes it clear, "Oh, Tanis. Oh, my Tanis." She's deeply in love with Tanis. So what are you going to derive from that as an understanding, Dan? Okay, so she's obsessed with Tanis. She's helping Sturm to get brownie points with Tanis. She's honest about this. And yet, Solastrin, Porthios, and Derek seem to have the mentality, oh, so she'll sleep with any guy. Or she's willing to marry Sturm. Where did you get this idea from? She said she wants Tanis. So she wants Tanis.
Sturm is, in a way, a means to an end.
He's the best friend she's just trying to cozy up to get to Tanis. So this obsession with her being a lady of the night, these three guys all think the same way. It actually makes a lot of sense, because a lot of wealthier folk tend to think the same way no matter the civilization. Your common layman in, let's say, Japan is going to be very individualistic and very different from, say, someone from Texas, who's going to be very different from someone in France, who's going to be very different from the common layman in Germany. They're all going to have different values and belief systems, and even different religious ideas. Their art will resemble each other because of the universal unconscious and archetypes, but the individuals themselves will have different values and belief systems. There are universal stuff to everyone, but there's also differences across all cultures. But rich people, or at least all leaders of declining empires, are the same type of person. Statesmen of rising empires are different from each other. You have Charlemagne. Charlemagne is a very different type of leader than, say, Commodus. But at the same time, Charlemagne is a very different type of person from Augustus Caesar. Augustus was the head of a rising empire, and Charlemagne was the head of a rising empire as well. But they're two very different societies with two very different values, ideas, and belief systems. And that's the nature of the game. The great men of history are typically very fascinating figures, far more so than the idiots of history.
Problem with Solastrin, Porthios, and Derek Crownguard is that there's a lack of responsibility and accountability.
But they also have the belief that all men behave like themselves and all women tend to be slaves to their own desires, neglecting to take into account the possibility that people can rise above their desires. What is Sturm's motivation? It must be the same base urges as Derek or Solastrin or Porthios. Well, in reality, Sturm is motivated by patriotism and a sense of nationalistic love for Salamia and a sense of love for the oath. That is to say, es soldados of Mifas, his honor. Lorana is motivated by her love for Tanis. This does not seem like it's something that they consider even a possibility. And that's the difference. Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman have said that most of their cast are middle to working class individuals. So to an extent, this is the royalty and the nobility unable to understand the lower classes. The leaders of empires in decline ultimately prove themselves unable to understand the lower classes. Just take any period in history. And the thing about this slander is that it irritates Sturm, and Derek proceeds to lead a chevauchée out of the castle. The tower is declared to be sacred in 347, and only the High Clerics can enter it, which is why the Solamnic Knights have refused to enter it. That's an interesting piece of lore. So they still take their faith and religion seriously, which is showing that beneath this declining period for Solamnia, there's a hint that they can maybe turn the tide around. They can still rise back to their former glory. And this is always the case. A society in decline can easily reverse the decline. There are ways to do it. It just takes one great statesman. Derek pushes for an attack, foolishly, as said. Lord Alfred follows him, foolishly, and Sturm tries to beg Alfred not to listen to Derek. Of course, on page 356, we get a conflict between Sturm and Lorana, where Sturm decides he needs to send Lorana away for her own safety, and she ends up insisting on staying, even though she'd suffer a far worse fate than any of the men. Sturm ends up telling telling her that Felgard may well fall, another region of Solamnia. He tries to lie and doesn't succeed because he's trying to tell her. He knows the dragons are coming, telling her, live your own life. You can't be Tanis. I can't be Tanis. He isn't here. We've got to face that. He isn't here, because she calls upon Tanis and says it's what he would do. He would stay there to die by Sturm's side. Sturm, of course, apologizes to her, and they make peace, and Tass blubbers about finding a dragon orb. I have the theory that they didn't really properly wield it, and that it's what sent some of the dragons into a frenzy. And the dragons, of course, end up trapped and simply use it as a bait and switch to hit the dragons with, which is actually a really good strategy. That said, Sturm, on page 362, begins to crack in terms of his faith in his belief system. The quote is really fascinating. All of his life he had followed the code and the measure. The code. Es sularis of mifas. My honor is my life. This code was all he had left. The measure was gone. It had failed. Rigid, inflexible. The measure had encased the knights in steel heavier than their armor. The knights, isolated, fighting to survive, had clung to the measure in despair, not realizing that it was an anchor weighing them down. Sturm ends up thinking to himself, why was I different? But he knew the answer, and it's where he thinks that maybe he's learned to see the eyes through slanted eyes, smaller eyes, and even hourglass eyes. To an extent, yes, but also no. And that he saw it in the world in all its radiant colors, in all its bleak grayness, rather than black and white, like Derek. And I would argue that not exactly. Now, there are those who try to project onto the world that there's only gray and black, and that there is no white. That said, Laurana volunteers herself to try to wield Dragon Orb in place of Tass, because she's worried for Tass. But the problem is she needs a diversion. Sturm volunteers and grabs a bow and arrow for the first time in Dragonlance. He did have some training with a bow and arrow. He ends up actually doing pretty good on 369 and 370. That is where it gets almost comedic with how well he does against the dragons. But then he begins to self-doubt. The dragon fear ends up starting to kick in. Sturm rallies. This is where it gets really sad. No, Sturm got hold of himself. Everything else was gone. His ideals, his hopes, his dreams. The knighthood was collapsing. The measure had been found wanting. Everything in his life was meaningless. His death must not be so. He would buy Laurana time, buy it with his life, since that was all he had to give, and he would die according to the code, since that was all he had to cling to.
That is so heartbreaking. Someone like Sturm did not deserve that.
No. He deserved a lot better.
Should have been their crown guard.
And of course, he raises his sword in the air in the knight's salute, and it's returned seemingly with grave dignity. Kitiara still chooses to slay Sturm, although she could have easily turned back. The battle was already over. The battle had been won for Solamnia. Sturm had beaten her. This is an act of pure spite, as she had been unable to beat his armies due to her being incompetent. And I say her being incompetent. You have 3 dragons. The enemy does not have an army anymore, or at least their army has been pretty much routed. They're hiding in a tower, and yet you still lost. The thing is, how could you lose? You have Death Knights at your disposal. You have dragons at your disposal. From the jaws of victory, she sees defeat. To an extent, there's no point in slaying him, because you've lost. Accept it with dignity. But she could not accept it, and decided to slay Sturm out of pure spite, as said. This is the sort of thing that shows she has no honor. And I know there's a contingent of fans who foolishly believe her to be some sort of honorable figure. That's folly. It's ridiculous. She has no honor. Laurana ends up plunging outside to see Sturm's corpse with Kitiara standing over it, and Kitiara, of course, mocks her and says we're both women in love, and Laurana thinks this means they're besties forever. I'm joking there. I'm being hyperbolic, but in the next novel, she'll choose to trust Kitiara over Flint and Tass for some weird reason, because Laurana's delusional and believes that all women have to trust each other. This is a fascinating trope, where all sisters have to stick together, sisters before bros. This is where Wace and Hickman subvert something, a trope, and do it really well. The whole idea that the only person a woman can trust is each other is subverted, just as it was in Zeta Gundam with Rekoa and Emma, when Rekoa showed herself to be a treacherous snake in the grass time and again. So Kitiara plays on Laurana here, and it's subverted. In that regard, it's really interesting that they chose to do that, to show Kitiara to be catty and treacherous and to have no honor. Disney itself would subvert this trope in The Little Mermaid, when Ariel would be pushed to believe Ursula, who may not say it in these words, but basically says, we're both women, you can trust me, when no, you can't trust her. Now, I'm not saying that women should not trust each other. No, to the contrary. I actually think that a lass culture, like we see in Japan, for example, is actually very healthy. Women should be able to trust each other and rely on each other in order to stay away from unsavory men. Societies with lass cultures are a lot more more stable, in my opinion, than those without. Societies with lad cultures, the Irish culture and French culture and Japanese culture, are far healthier in a lot of ways. Oh, and I should also mention Filipinish culture also apparently has a lass culture and even a lad culture. So Dragon Orb of the tower also shined a white light, showing that this is the white dragon orb. So maybe that's why it could not work on the blue dragons as well, because it's more inclined towards manipulating the white dragons. So it just simply drove the blue dragons into a frenzy. So Wace and Hickman had a lot of great writing in regards to the dragon orbs in hindsight. That aside, we then get epilogue of Alhana realizing Sturm has died. Heart-wrenching part of the story as she realizes her soulmate has passed. Honestly, it would have been more interesting had she been present for Sturm's passing and for us to see her wailing in grief and essentially burying her husband for all intents and purposes. And I know people would say, well, we don't need to see that scene. No, we do. Such scenes of humanity are the most important. Even if you don't show it on screen per se and you have it mentioned that she wailed and she held Sturm's corpse to her breast, where the characters describe what happened and say, wow, was she ever grief-stricken? That would still be something. But we never actually get to see it. Maybe like to at some point have a D&D campaign with my ideas for Dragonlance, a different vision for second generation and the Summer of Chaos and War of Souls. Actually, War of Souls I think should be kept as mostly intact as it was, because it was good for the most part.
That was rather tragic and sad. It's like,
this is compared to episode 5, Empire Strikes Back, but I'm going to argue the difference is that the tone at the end of the episode 5 novel is more one of disappointment as you realize just how much of a liar Ben Kenobi was and Yoda had become. It's about disillusionment. Whereas with Winter Night, it's more sorrow, I would argue, and melancholy. And you're filled with grief for Sturm as you realize he died for nothing. Although his death comes to mean something. So he did die for something. He died for the knighthood, to restore its values, because he's ultimately a more Jeanne d'Arc type figure. I know that they tried to build up Lorana into that, but I see more spades of that in Sturm. He restores the core values of the knighthood to the knighthood. But the problem is, it comes at the cost of Sturm. And I think that there's a lot of potential that there could have been. And I think that maybe this is just ultimately one of the most sad endings in a fantasy novel. Honestly, this is what elevates Dragonlance, despite my griping, far above so many other fantasy stories, as the sorrow and the melancholy here is true darkness. It's not this weird, spoilt brat, hippie darkness, but true darkness. This is more in line, to an extent, with Tolkien and Howard's vision of a world progressively in decline, and that's filled with a sorrow to it and an ancientness to it, but that in war, the heroes are always the first to perish. And Howard and Tolkien truly tend to showcase this. You look at Hour of the Dragon and Lord of the Rings, and even the Silmarillion, and even many of the Conan short stories, and you have a sense of heroes are always the first to perish, even though they mean well. And I think that, in a way, this is much more fitting for a Star Wars version of fantasy.
it is sad that Sturm died because of the games and selfishness of those such as Celostrin, Portheos, and Derek Crownguard.
What annoys me is they live. Although that said, I have to view that Portheos, maybe archetypally I'm looking at the trouble of Sturm and Alhana and Portheos as maybe I'm looking at the idea that maybe Sturm's son should have been the same kind of archetypal figure as Jason or Jason and the Argonauts, Portheos serving in the evil stepfather role. I think that would have been more interesting archetypally. That would harken back to Greek mythology and, my obsession with Greek myths. So anyways, tell us what you all think of this video. And don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Kitiara seeking to destroy Sturm and all his goodness.